So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Victor Hwang, who's our keynote speaker this afternoon. And he and his team traveled here to be with us today. And we're so pleased to have them here and sharing their ideas. Jason Grill being part of his team, leading the panel discussion this morning. And then Victor giving us his remarks. So many of you know that Victor's been to New Mexico a couple of times before, and he's been a speaker at some of our summits in the past. And in fact, some of you probably know that the inspiration for this building and UNM Rainforest Innovations come from Victor's work. I've known Victor about 10 years now, and he's the author of the Rainforest book, which describes how you build an entrepreneurial ecosystem, which is what we are doing here in New Mexico. Victor has an impressive background. Of course, he's the founder of Right to Start, which you're going to learn more about. He also has his own economic growth consultancy business. He's been vice president of entrepreneurship with the Kauffman Foundation and leading the Kauffman Foundation, which is internationally recognized as one of the important foundations supporting entrepreneurial development. He's also the founder of some startup companies himself. He's also been an investor, and he is an attorney, and we welcome him here to hear from him today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Lisa. It means so much for me personally to be here. Obviously, this building and when someone writes a book, they have no idea where it's going to end up. It's actually a great act of vulnerability to write a book. Those of you that have done it before, maybe appreciate how hard it is, because it's not the actual writing that's hard, although that's very hard, but the actual fear of not knowing what's going to happen when you put out a book. And so to actually know that a book I put out has inspired a building and a whole way of thinking around this work here in New Mexico has been very gratifying. It's something that's rare for an author to be able to see. And so I'm very grateful for it. And it's very similar to the entrepreneurial experience, which is this great sense of diving into the unknown. And so thank you so much for taking the ideas of the rainforest and bringing it here. So I want to start first by, there you go, just saying hello and introducing myself a little bit more. So I am a child of entrepreneurs. My family came to the United States with $300 and 2 bags of laundry. And one of the things they had to do when I was fortunate to go to college was they actually, to be able to afford to send me to college, had to start a business. That was after taking out a second mortgage on their house and putting everything on the line, was actually starting a business to be able to make up for the deficit. And it worked. The business was able to thrive and was able to pay for college and build wealth for the family and also create jobs for people in the community at the same time. And this was in Austin, Texas, starting in the 1990s. So we also watched how businesses and entrepreneurship transformed the city of Austin as well. So it's a very near and dear issue to me. My grandfather had been an entrepreneur at a small retail store in Taiwan way back when. And so entrepreneurship is something I grew up with. I saw it firsthand. And so later in my life, as I kept going, I got into the work of thinking around, well, where does this all come from? Why are some places thriving while other places fall behind? And so I've spent the last 2 decades of my life looking at this issue around how do you spur entrepreneurial growth and opportunity. And it's something that I've realized now, it leads to this big question, which I think is what kind of at the heart of what we're tackling here today, which is, how do we create prosperity? Where does prosperity come from? And one of the things that I've learned over 2 decades of doing this work, I've started businesses, I've invested in businesses, I've grown them, I've sold them, I've shut down more than I've cared to admit, is that prosperity for the last century or so, the narrative has been that it comes from the top down. It comes from big businesses, it comes from established corporations, it comes from government support. And what I've come to see firsthand through both the work of watching my family grow up and build businesses and also being involved in that work myself for over 2 decades is that actually comes from the bottom up. Prosperity comes from the bottom up, And it's many ways, one way to think of it is like the story of David and Goliath. So much of what we think of as the economic narrative or economic development is around how do you build Goliaths, or how do you serve Goliaths, or how do you make Goliath stronger. But if you actually look at the research, you look at the data, and if you look at the stories of people who are actually in the real world, you learn it's actually the Davids. It's 1,000 Davids that are actually more powerful than any Goliath. And any community that learns to support the development of their Davids actually has something more powerful than any Goliath could possibly imagine. And that is the story of places like Silicon Valley, but it's also the story of the human race, which is that we create great things from the bottom up. Every great thing started with one person, two person, three people sitting around a campfire or sitting around a coffee shop, dreaming up the possibility of what could be. You know, what if the world was different? What if this product existed? What if this service was there? And so that idea of how do we spur that? How do we create that at scale, at the level of an entire city, at the level of an entire state, or even at the level of an entire country, is something that I've really personalized and took as a personal mission for myself over the years. So coming here has been very exciting in another respect, which is this is actually the 10th anniversary of the book, The Rainforest. And so it was actually written a decade ago, which is very hard to believe. For those of you that are younger, decades go very, very fast. The Rainforest book, as I mentioned, I had no idea where it would end up when I started. But what's happened over that last decade has been gratifying to me beyond what I could have imagined. One, you see places like this that have taken the ideas and implemented them. But what's also happened now over the last decade is these ideas now are getting embedded into the way economic development is getting done across the country. For instance, the International Economic Development group, where that actually certifies people in the field of economic development, actually teaches people now on how to build entrepreneurship-led economic development derived from these ideas. Not just my ideas, but others who have been thinking about this work and in this field have taken this work around rainforest and ecosystem building and turned it into something that is being spread across hundreds of communities now, both within the US and abroad. I've seen lots of countries abroad actually take these ideas and implement them into their work. It even goes off to North Korea. There was actually people building rainforest ecosystems within countries that you don't think there's entrepreneurship happening. But I haven't been there personally, but from what I understand is people take these ideas and they're actually using them on the ground and trying to fill those gaps wherever they can in a society. So it's been really cool to watch this happen and to celebrate this with you. This is, in many ways, this is kind of a celebratory event to come here and share a decade's worth of work in the rainforest with you. And it's also, as many of you know, the 5th anniversary of the Lobo Rainforest. And so we're celebrating this joint anniversary of watching a place like this come to life. And what's so interesting about this place is that it is one of the leading examples of how you manifest this idea in a physical space that actually serves as a collision point between all these different groups in a community, especially in a community where you see disparate sectors where people are siloed off from each other and creating places where they can come together and work together and build and create. And I know that's what Lisa and others have really focused on over the years, which is creating that space for all these different pieces of the community to come together. And so this is a quote from the book, which I know the folks here at Lobo Rainforest have actually used in the work that's being done here, which is a place where human creativity, business acumen, scientific discovery, investment capital, and other elements come together in a special recipe that nurtures budding ideas into flourishing and sustainable enterprises. It's how do you get all these different pieces to work together? And this is a diagram from the book as well, which shows all these different elements. So a lot of times you hear about the money, and we've talked about that in the prior segment today, but it's how all these different pieces fit together, including the money and the capital, from the talent to the coaches and the mentors, which Senator Padilla was talking about, to academia and research, which the UNM has provided, to business support services, access to global market supply chains, news and media, and the stories that are being told about a community, the culture, the values, the models, the rule of law, real estate, education, workforce, trade and industry groups, government, ideas, and inventions. All this has to fit together, which makes it really hard to do because no one person controls any one of these things. What you can do, though, is actually create a place where all this starts to come together and start to drive that synergistic effort where people start to work together and realize that they can achieve common ends mutually. So for those of you that may not be familiar with the rainforest, which may be some of you, I'll give you just a few minutes kind of reprise of where it comes from and why this way of thinking is actually really useful. So in a natural rainforest, we think of all the different elements interacting where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And it makes sense because in a natural rainforest, that's kind of the metaphor a lot of us think about what a great, sustainable, diverse ecosystem looks like. But a really useful way to think of rainforests is in contrast to what it's not, which is the contrast between a rainforest and a farm. So on a farm, which is the dominant mode of how we think of business and economics today, you know in advance what you want to create. So you know the crop that you're trying to grow. So if you're trying to grow corn, for instance, actually here I should say chili peppers. So if you're trying to grow chili peppers, red or green, I think is the answer. And the right answer is Christmas, right? So you want the red and the green. So if you want to grow red and green chili peppers, what you do is you optimize the conditions to grow those chili peppers. You create the right soil conditions, the watering conditions, the sunlight conditions. You control everything to the finest degree possible, and you optimize the development of that specific crop. And if you have a weed on a farm, what do you do with weeds? Well, you don't want weeds. You kill the weed, you pull the weed, or you even make sure the weed doesn't even have a chance to emerge in the first place by controlling the environment so precisely that weed doesn't have a chance to grow. But in a rainforest, what's a weed? Well, everything's a weed in a rainforest. You never know what's going to turn into the most valuable thing in a rainforest. That is, everything is both a weed and a crop at the same time because you just don't know if it has a chance to grow. And so if you think about a lot of great companies that have evolved over time, in fact, almost every great company you've heard of, if you look in the early stages of that company, no one in the beginning had any idea what was going to happen with it. And that goes for companies from Google and Twitter and Facebook to companies here like Meow Wolf. If you've ever watched the documentary about how Meow Wolf was created, those folks had no idea, right? They were just playing around and experimenting with art and seeing what was possible. They had no idea it would turn into such a great enterprise. And so you have to nurture the development of weeds. But what's the best way to grow rainforests? Well, people have tried to build rainforests by planting lots of trees. And what happens is what you might expect, which is the trees die, nothing takes hold, the rainforest collapses. So you cannot build rainforests by planting lots of trees, by crop planting. What matters in rainforests is the interaction of all the environmental factors. It's the sunlight, it's the humidity, it's the soil conditions, it's the nutrients, it's all the flora and fauna working together to make the rainforest sustainable. Again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's similar to human conditions as well, which is we shape the environment around us. And so that's the difference. When you're trying to build ecosystems like you have here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, you have to shape the environmental conditions properly. And so when we think about growing weeds into crops, which is the process of business development, you find that how people interact in the system actually has a big effect. It's in addition to the tangible assets, you have money, you have the hard factors of production. You can grow chili peppers in New Mexico better than you can grow them in other places. But the culture, the way people interact actually has that powerful invisible force that drives everything else. And so if you look underneath that, there's a set of rules and behaviors and values that drive those behaviors. And I won't go into these in detail. I think a lot of them are posted on the walls around here, so you can just read them. But I'll go quickly into the values. You have values like openness, diversity, serendipity, fairness, experimentation, play, giving. And then you have other values, which are the values of crop production, which are excellence, loyalty, dependability, success, quality, precision, and reciprocity. And those are all great things too, because you need those to scale up and to build products and services that are dependable. But the process of the creative origins of something, the process of innovation, actually comes from the left-hand side as you're creating weeds, and businesses strive to cross over to the other side, which is more predictable. And this is the tension of ecosystems, the tension between creation and innovation on one side and scalability and sustainability and productivity on the other side. And so how you think about values and your ability to embrace all that and realize how to use those types of values that drive innovation when you need it is really, really powerful. And I see that here. I see people really embracing that and really taking those values to heart and trying to make great things happen. So as a result of that, what you find, And I've seen this now in a lot of communities I work with, which is that ultimately the weeds they always feel like they're trying to break out of that crack in the cement, right? Like weeds, and we've talked about here in that panel earlier, which is it's so hard to innovate. It's so hard to create. It's so hard to build an enterprise from scratch that every new entrepreneur or innovator trying to do something always feels like they're trying to be that weed that cracks out of that little hole. And so when I see this picture, I actually really identify with it. I really identify with that plant trying to break out of the sidewalk, because anytime you try to do something new, it's like that. The forces pushing back on you are so significant. But what we want to be empathetic and sympathetic to that weed, and to realize that we are all that weed at some point in our lives. We all care about that person, that idea, that thing that's trying to break out of that crack in the sidewalk. And so when you apply that to human ecosystems, the goal then is to not think about cities or states or countries as just masses of people, which is what we do. This is what economists do. They think of us as masses of people. But to realize that actually masses of people are made up of us, which is human beings in small groups, having conversations, talking about how to make things better. That's how everything starts, is at the level of small groups of people working together. So that's a shift in the frame that's really powerful, is to think about how do you get away from thinking of it as just an ocean of people to just small groups and teams trying to figure it out, and supporting that process, being very caring of nurturing of the weeds that are trying to grow. So rainforests protect and nurture the growth of weeds because they set out to do so. And if you look at places that have done it well, many places have done it accidentally, but you can also do it on purpose. But you have to build a community of people that understand how to do that and care about this together. But here's the sort of the turn in what I'm trying to get at, which leads to Right to Start. If you actually look at the data and the hard numbers, America's actually failing at this as a country. And this is what's led me and my colleagues into thinking around, all right, so what do we do about this? How do we actually start to turn this situation? So America's been failing at protecting and nurturing the growth of our weeds. We've actually been in what some people call a startup slump for decades. It's this invisible thing that's happening because it's so slow. It's like when people talk about the frog in the boiling pot doesn't know the water's getting hot. The fish in the aquarium doesn't know the water's been getting dirty. It's been happening to us over time. And so this is census data that we put together in a graph at Kauffman when I was there, that actually shows the startup rate over time of the last 4+ decades in America. So over the span of decades, the startup rate in this country has been declining. This is the proportion of businesses in the economy that are young enterprises. And so when people say, like in the prior panel, they said, people that start businesses aren't represented in government, or people that start businesses, people just don't know how hard it is anymore. It's because there's actually fewer people doing it. And there's a similar number on labor force participation. There's about half the rate of people in the labor force that actually work for a young enterprise today than worked for an older enterprise. So fewer and fewer people actually know how to do it, and fewer people know how to transmit that knowledge onto others, and fewer people are able to inspire others to do it on their own. So we've been in a startup slump. So this has been something that we've been trying to raise the alarm about, but because it's been this slow decline over time, it's hard to feel a sense of urgency about it. I think it's time now we start to feel that sense of urgency. This is a crisis that's come to us over time, where suddenly, like in the prior panel, it takes 30 phone calls to even start a business, right? Like, how did we get there? It's been this slow creep over time that we didn't even notice until we got here. And so Right to Start is born of this basic idea that everyone deserves a fair shot to start and grow their own business. In fact, we call it Right to Start because we actually think of it as a basic fundamental human right. Just like you've got a right to speech or a right to worship, you've got a right to build and create, to take the God-given talents you were born with and create something of value back into the world. That is something that was sort of embedded in the original promise of what this country aspired to be. The country hasn't always been perfect at that, but that was sort of baked into the country, the pursuit of happiness, the actually ability to take what you have and to create something out of it. And so we're trying to go back to the future, which is to say we can take that original spirit and bring it back to life again in this country. And so to do that, we have to drive civic change, broad-based change, to remove barriers between people and their dreams. And when we think about who's an entrepreneur, we have to take a very broad-based approach to who that is. And so some people want to run a bread and breakfast. Other people want to start a bakery. Others want to launch tech companies. And others want to import goods. Some people want to start a creative art thing, right? You never know what's going to become a great, successful enterprise. And so the goal is to have a society that actually embraces all of it, because you want to give a chance for the weeds to grow. And we have to allow the protection and the nurturing of those weeds. So at Right to Start, what we're tackling to do this is three key strategic pillars. One is to change minds. That is to lift the voices of the entrepreneurs through storytelling and media. A lot of the real struggles of what entrepreneurs deal with day to day is kind of not known. The story of my parents really wasn't known until I started telling it. But that's not even that remarkable a story. I mean, every entrepreneur, I found this, it's sort of a test you can try. Every entrepreneur you know, or anyone that's ever started a business at some point in their life, just go into the origin stories of how it started. 90+% of the time, it's a heroic journey, which probably overcame all sorts of odds that were keeping it from happening. There's a lot of people that actually tried to keep there's a lot of forces that try to keep things from emerging. And so every entrepreneurial story is actually a heroic journey in and of itself. We have to lift up those stories so people understand it again, and they realize just how hard it really is. So those stories need to get told. And a big part of it is folks like us that care about this work have to be part of that storytelling. A second piece is to change policies, actually change the very systems themselves. Because over time, what's happened is these systems have gotten harder and harder to work with. My colleague Jason Grill mentioned earlier, it's like pebbles in a stream. And what the metaphor means is that entrepreneurs don't just die from a single blow. It's over time and by the accretion of lots of obstacles. So if you throw a pebble in a stream, the stream just keeps on flowing. It doesn't really matter. If you throw a few dozen pebbles into the stream keeps on flowing. If you throw hundreds or thousands of pebbles in a stream, the stream stops to flow. And you actually dam up the stream. And that's what's happened over time. So we've got to actually look at broad-based change across the entire civic policy system to engage. And the way to do that is to advocate for better ways of being entrepreneurial with policymakers and civic leaders, so they can hear this and so they can take action. You'd think someone's been doing this, but we've been working across the country. I've been traveling road trips. We've been talking to state legislators and city policymakers and city leaders and community leaders across the country. No one's really doing this. So it's really up to us. We are the ones that actually have to be involved in these types of discussions with our leadership, because no one else, frankly, is doing it. And three is to change communities. That is, we've got to organize and mobilize citizens to take action. Those citizens are entrepreneurs themselves, or they're people that care about entrepreneurs. And one of the silver linings that's happened in the last few years with the pandemic is that lots of people are trying to be entrepreneurial in their bedrooms, in their kitchen tables, in their basements, in their garages in a way they weren't before. Some out of desperation, some because they saw an opportunity, but people are trying to do it in new ways. And it's somewhat amusing, but more sad, just in the last couple of years, hearing stories of people saying, I never knew it was that hard, because these are people that didn't know folks who'd done it before, or just never tried it before themselves, even though they thought they could do it. And these often can be very intelligent, sophisticated people and just had no idea how hard it was. So we need to organize citizens to take action, and that includes the families and the friends and the neighbors that you know that actually would care about it if they actually knew. So Right to Start, we launched this just a couple of years ago, and we've been growing fast. So we've got a network of ambassadors across the country. These are civic leaders and influencers that work across the country to help spread the story. We've got advocates, and we're lucky to have one of them, Edgar Solis, who will be leading a panel later this afternoon. And these are entrepreneurs in the communities that are like field organizers. They're working to build their communities up from the bottom. We've got local stories. We've been publishing op-eds, including one with Edgar here in the Albuquerque Journal. And we've got Right to Start Acts introduced as well. These are bills that state legislatures are actually introducing. And we've heard cities starting to take up these ideas as well. And I'll talk a bit more about some of those too. So we're actually driving some significant change from the grassroots very quickly. And so here's some examples of the op-eds that we've been placing and the videos we've produced to try to tell these stories. and also photos of the grassroots work we're doing. So these are photos of people actually doing petitions to petition their city council to waive business license fees or to create one-stop shops. This is something entrepreneurs have never done before, but every other cause does this. They have petitions, they talk to their policymakers and say, why can't we change something? And so that's what we're doing now. We actually are doing petitions in local communities, and we're finding it works. People actually respond. We're still a democracy, you know, sometimes barely holding on, but we are still a democracy, and our leaders actually care when citizens get together and say, we want to change something. And so this is what we can do. We can actually get together and start to make these types of changes in our society and our civic system. So I'll talk about this poll we just did recently. So Jason mentioned we did this bipartisan poll. So one of the things that we found was interesting is that no one, as far as we know, has ever conducted a voter poll about what they think of entrepreneurship issues and messages in the country, as far as we could find. And so we decided to do one. And we hired two of the top pollsters in the country, one on the left and one on the right. So it's a bipartisan polling group. And they're both very prominent pollsters on both sides. And we started asking, like, what do voters think of entrepreneurship? And we found this, which is, it is almost unanimous across like the entire population of America that we asked them, is this important to America's future, that citizens have a fair opportunity to start and grow their business? Not that should citizens be able to have this, but is this important to America's future? 94% across party lines say this is important to America's future. Our pollsters said they'd never seen this before in any issue they tested. It's almost unheard of, especially in this polarized environment, to have an issue that unites Americans this much. But this is what we found. Pretty strong power that people actually believe in this deeply. It's sort of part of the American DNA and spirit. The other thing that's really interesting, and this is something that Jason talked about earlier in the prior panel, which is a piece of data that more people need to know about. And a lot of you will probably know this already, but very few people outside of groups like these actually know this, which is that new businesses, the entrepreneurs, create almost all net job growth in an economy. So when we talk about jobs, you listen to the media, you listen to our politicians generally speak, and they talk about jobs, and it tends to be a focus on large corporations or existing businesses. Well, it's the young entrepreneurial businesses that are creating almost all the net job growth. So here's data. This is from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it shows over time where the jobs come from. I need to explain this chart a bit because it's a little bit confusing. If you look at the blue line at the top, these are businesses younger than 5 years. Over the span of about 2 decades, they are consistently in the range of 1 to 3 million jobs a year created by businesses that are younger than 5 years. This is on net across that entire category of businesses. The red line are businesses that are 5 to 9 years old. These are midlife kind of startups as they're starting to get a little more mature, and they're kind of evening out at that age. They're netting about zero. The older businesses, over 10 years old, you can see that's the gray line. They shed jobs in times of recession. So you got the 2000 recession, you got the 2009 recession, and they never bring them back. They go back to zero. They don't actually hire back the people they fired. They actually just go back to zero over time. So big businesses actually shed jobs over time. Young businesses create the jobs. So this is a really powerful fact. And what we found in our poll is that only 18% of voters actually know this, or they guessed it. Most voters think it's either large businesses or existing businesses. So we've got some work to do here. We've got to tell people this is actually the case. It's the entrepreneurs that drive job growth. And new businesses don't just drive homegrown jobs. We talked about that. The data and the research now, and this is, by the way, some of this research has just emerged in the last few years. So it's not anyone's fault in particular that they didn't have all this, but now we have this data. Now we got to let people know. So it's our fault if they don't know this. So they create homegrown jobs. They grow GDP. You can actually track where GDP comes from. It comes from innovation, and innovation comes from young emerging entrepreneurs. They increase lifetime incomes. People who start businesses make 10% more income over their lifetimes. Now, those of you that are entrepreneurs know you actually make less in the first few years. So you actually make less in the beginning, but over your lifetime, you make more money as someone that starts a business. They increase community wealth. For every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a county, the average household income in a county goes up by over $400. So it actually has a ripple effect across the entire region that an entrepreneur is in. It's not just that entrepreneur themselves, it actually increases wealth for everybody, which makes sense because they're providing better products and services, and there's a ripple effect to what they're creating. They diversify goods and services. We saw this during the pandemic when we couldn't get goods and services, and entrepreneurs just stepped up and started making stuff from PPE to sanitizer. They were the ones that did it. And there were stories about how, like, and still today, like people that made hand sanitizer, like distilleries, have ended up getting fined tens of thousands of dollars by health departments for making hand sanitizer because they didn't have licenses. A whole set of issue around how we don't respect the people that were filling that gap and trying to diversify our goods and services. But we're seeing this problem now, which is this shift now in thinking, how do we bring home our supply chains so we're more resilient, so we can actually build through future crises like this? And they fight inequality and poverty. More entrepreneurial activity means less inequality and less poverty. For every 1% increase in entrepreneurship in a state, there's a corresponding 2% decrease in the poverty rate in a state. This is across all 50 states. So this is very powerful. And we don't talk about that very often. You don't hear people say more entrepreneurship means less poverty, but the data bears it out. So entrepreneurs know all these issues. They know it's a problem, even though they don't articulate it, because entrepreneurs themselves don't have a lot of time and money to speak for themselves. So 81% of entrepreneurs say government favors big businesses over them. This is a survey from the Kauffman Foundation. 69% of entrepreneurs say government doesn't care about them. And 41% of Americans would start their dream business in 6 months if they could, but only 2% actually do. So that's the gap between America's entrepreneurial ambition and America's actual entrepreneurial realization. We are underperforming by far the number of people that are actually interested in starting and growing and building. So Right to Start, we've been doing this work, I mentioned on the ground. Right to Start acts and recommendations were introduced in 5 states this year: Missouri, Hawaii, Kansas, Florida, and Oklahoma. And they're being already implemented in Illinois, where they're creating an office for minority entrepreneurship based off of our work. And in Missouri, they actually passed the House and the Senate. We got down to the 1-yard line to get it all signed and buttoned up, and we just missed out. But third time, as they were saying in the prior panel, it usually takes a few sessions to get these through. So we're very close next year to having some breakthroughs. And then we've also driven change on the federal and city level as well in many ways. And I was just in a town in eastern rural Kentucky a few weeks ago, and the city council was going to introduce a Right to Start set of policies. So we're seeing this happen in lots of different places now. The city of El Paso, not far from here, said they want to institute a one-stop shop. We just heard from them about this work too, based off of this work we're doing. So we're starting to see this momentum build and build. Oh yeah, and the other thing is we're actually taking pictures of state capitol buildings along the way. So this is something where actually some people collect baseball stadium photos, other people collect like celebrity photos. For us, the celebrities are like state capitol buildings. So this is what we're doing. And we also have a field guide for policymakers. For those of you that care about these issues, it's not just for the policymakers themselves, but if you care about these issues, we've got a set of resources online that you can look at that talks about all these different issues. And we actually have a handout we'll give you, which lists the policy recommendations as well. So you've got this information with you as well. We support model legislation. So one of the things that's great is when you start to get bills introduced and you start to get momentum, it creates more and more momentum. Momentum begets momentum, just like building a startup business does. The more adopters you get, the more people are willing to follow and copy. It gets easier for them to envision what you're trying to do. And so we actually are getting model legislation. We had some adopted recently by the Council of State Governments South region, and we're getting more and more of these types of bills and ideas getting picked up by others. And so we get requests all the time, every week, from policymakers that want to look at the models of other bills we've already done, and that's been really exciting because we actually have more and more examples to share out. So we've got policy recommendations here. I'm not going to go into all 10 of these, and there's more actually on the field guide, which there's probably like 14, 15 on the field guide that you can look at. This will be in the thing we hand out to you as well, so you'll have that. But I'll go into just a few of these. This is the 5% to start, which we talked about already, but I'll go into deeper. Office of Entrepreneurship and the one-stop shop. 0 barriers to start. Reducing licensing issues, early tax hassles, tax relief, non-compete reform, an entrepreneur impact statement, small business borrowers bill of rights about online lending and healthcare mobility. There's a lot there. I won't go into all this, but there's a lot of meat here. If you really want to double click on it, you can go pretty deep into this work. I will talk about 5% to start a little bit. In the prior panel, they talked about government contracts, and that's a big part of it. There's actually three areas where we suggest 5% to start. And what puts them in common is they're areas where government actually subsidizes large incumbents already, significantly, which are the areas of economic development. So if you think of the subsidies that cities and states pay to large corporations to move, when Amazon was building its second headquarters, 238 cities were throwing them huge subsidies. Can we shift just a small sliver of those support systems towards the young enterprises so people can build homegrown businesses? This, by the way, was one of our highest polling issues. When you tell entrepreneurs, when you ask American voters, should we shift some of the money that we give to support large corporate recruitment and give it to support homegrown enterprise building? Voters love that. Because they see these stories and they see the money given to large companies, and we get it. Those are great jobs, often sometimes very high-paying jobs, sometimes not, but we get that. But can you just shift just a part of it towards homegrown enterprise development? 2, government contracts. Government contracts. Anyone that's ever gone after a government contract knows they are not easy to get, and a lot of it's just navigating the system to figure out how it even works. And this is at every level. Very few states have tracked how hard it is for new entrants to get government contracts, but at the federal level they did. More than half reduction in new entrants in federal contracting over the last 2 decades. That it's that much harder for new companies to get in. What's happening is if you're in the system, you just the system starts to work with you and it starts to get captured. It's harder for new folks to get in. So we're seeing that pretty common across the landscape, which is harder and harder for new folks to break into government contracting. And 3rd, workforce training. Workforce and education reform are a big part of this. Workforce training, I'll give you one example of how the system just is totally stacked against new enterprises or just ignored completely. There's the whole workforce training system, the official workforce training system in the US is called the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. That's $13 billion from the federal government that's given to the states. The states then give it out to local workforce development boards. Basically, 0 of that money goes towards teaching the workforce of people that want to create their own jobs in the workforce, and almost all of it goes towards people that are trying to fill jobs for large corporations. And if you think about, you'll ask, well, why is that? Because the federal law actually allows money to go towards entrepreneurship development and entrepreneurship support. It's because the state and the local levels are filled, large corporations advise workforce boards. Basically, we've got an industrial era model where they're actually teaching people industrial era systems, which is how do you place people into jobs? That's what workforce is. But if you think about the workforce today, what is the workforce? I mean, I think there's pretty wide agreement. It should be entrepreneurial skills that can be applied to create and innovate. We don't really teach that in the workforce training system today. That's $13 billion that could go to help train entrepreneurs. That's not done. Not even talking about the educational system, K through 12 or higher ed or community colleges. There's a lot more to be done around how we train and educate our workforce on this. Office of Entrepreneurship, we talked about this, one-stop shop. Just to get the voice of an entrepreneur in the system, to actually have someone that says, yes, I care, makes a huge difference. We found stories from places like Miami, where in Miami, we talked to an entrepreneur who had 30 steps they had to work through with the city of Miami to get a business started. In fact, included over 10 physically waiting in line at the city to actually get something permitted or signed off on. And then by the end of it, they actually have in fact, in the city of Miami, there was a whole secondary market of people that you paid to wait in line for you because it became a whole industry unto itself to wait in line to start a business. Well, they streamlined it. They actually digitized that service in the city now, and you can actually do it on a cell phone in a matter of days. They streamlined what was a 6-month, 30-step process for many people into a matter of days on a cell phone. But that was an intentional effort by the mayor who put out a ton of political capital on it and got almost no press coverage out of it because entrepreneurs didn't know, or they just didn't have the time to say thank you because they're too busy running and hustling to build their businesses. So this is part of the challenge, is even when people do good things, it's kind of lost in the system. Another example we've seen are other communities where people can't even start restaurants. Like in immigrant communities, they can't even open restaurants because they're unable to figure out how to navigate the system. So we've seen this happen all over the country, which is just too confusing, it's too complicated, there's too many steps. Third, zero barriers to start. This issue came up, which is, can you reduce the fees for the early years of a business? And I know there's some discussion about whether the fees make a difference or not. Well, $700 to $800 on average in the US to start a business with government fees alone. And if you think about half the country having basically no savings or only less than 3 months of savings, it means that you've effectively ruled out starting a business for about half the country as a matter of practicality. And let's say that money is not that much. Well, that's money they could apply towards building their product, marketing, supply purchases, actually building their enterprise. So we talk so much about getting more capital to a business early on, but if you can save them a few $100, that's the equivalent of getting them a few $100 of capital. And if you do that across all the businesses, it has this ripple effect that can be powerful. So zero barriers to start. So more about this poll, because it's actually really interesting about what we learned from entrepreneurship. And this goes to this issue of how do we together tackle this issue of entrepreneurial development, enterprise development. So what we found, the biggest takeaway from this is that America is a nation of silenced drivers. This fact that 94% of Americans say this issue is important to America's future, yet they don't see our leaders doing that much about it. And they don't see folks like us, frankly, doing that much to actually change the entire civic system to make it easier. And so it's up to us to start to fix that. So Americans actually believe in entrepreneurial dreams. There's so many Americans that actually want to start and grow, and they believe others have the right to do this, and they want leaders to do more. That's probably the main takeaway from this poll. In fact, we found that across all party lines, Americans are more likely to vote for candidates that make entrepreneurship access a key part of their campaigns. 62% of Americans say they'd be more likely to support a candidate that made entrepreneurship a key issue in their campaigns. And you can see this across party lines. So we are taking that to policymakers. So this is an issue because they just don't know. And if you think about the entrepreneurs you know, how many of them, when they're starting and building a business, really have the time to go out and have their voices heard on this issue? They generally don't. And so we've got to do it. So one of the things that came out of it was this issue of fees and red tape. So based on the polling numbers, if you actually took the polling numbers, about half of the people that wanted to start a business but didn't actually said it was in part because of government fees and or red tape. And so that works out to about 15 million businesses that don't exist in the economy today, in part because of fees and red tape. That's like a self-inflicted injury, right, on our society. We can fix that. That is a very fixable issue. So I won't go into all these numbers, but more about what voters like. They want more pro-entrepreneur policies and economic development, tax relief, capital access, red tape, non-competes, healthcare, tax hassles, regulatory burden, licensing, permitting, procurement, government contracts, and workforce. And these are actually not even the most favorable issues, but we're still seeing like 60 to 70 to 80% of voters want these things, right? This is sort of ranked in priority. So these are issues generally that are just really favorable in the policy world. And so we've got this really strange situation where we've got a ton of ideas, we've got a group of people that actually need help, we've got everyone widely agreeing that this is exactly the help that they need. We've got most of these ideas actually don't cost that much money to do, yet we're not able to implement them. So this should be a layup in America, if anything. It's hard, it's a tough political environment to get much done these days, but if there's anything that's a layup in American politics, it should be this stuff. So it's really up to us. It's because we have not really tried before. So I will kind of close it out now. And by the way, before I end this, I'm going to actually turn it over to you at the end. So we're actually going to do, if we got a little time, we'll do some breakout discussions because I actually want to capture some information from you that we can use on the team. But a few weeks ago, I took a road trip across America, and this was a road trip that was greatly delayed. I originally wanted to start this road trip 2+ years ago when we launched Right to Start, but a few things happened along the way, and it was not easy to take road trips for the last few years, but I actually did it just a few weeks ago. And I'm actually going to be doing lots of these road trips now because it was so rewarding. That photo in the upper right, that red muscle car, that was the car I rented, and it was a blast. When I got home with the car, so I drove from DC to Kansas City, where I'm living right now, And I got home and I parked the car in the driveway, and my wife's first reaction upon seeing the car was, "That is so obnoxious." So that is, yes, it was, but in a good way. So I got to meet entrepreneurs in Maryland, West Virginia, uh, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas. And I'm going to make my way out to the other corners of the United States in the coming year or two. Um, and I will say this, which is at the back of my mind before I went out on the road trip, there was a part of me that was thinking, is this country really fundamentally broken? Is it broken beyond repair? And that may be something that is in the back of your mind too. And uh, I will say it's not only not broken, but it's roaring back to life again. This country, there's a rejuvenative quality about this country from the grassroots. And you do not hear it in sort of the legacy media storyline, which is essentially about polarization and paralysis, which is sort of, if you read the news, you think this country is just, everyone hates each other, no one's getting anything done. But I will say, having traveled across these cities and states, small towns, urban areas, every race, every environment, university towns, everything in between, people are at work doing the stuff, and they are doing the work of fixing this country. And I saw that in every place. And it was very heartwarming to me, and it sort of reignited my fire about how important this work is, because people are doing the work. They're trying to regrow this country. Entrepreneurs are at the very front leading edge of it, and we need to be doing everything we can to feed and nurture and support that process, because we make it far harder than it needs to be, but it doesn't need to be. This is stuff that is happening, and this country is rejuvenating itself as we speak. And coming out here, hearing about the issues, I mean, just that prior panel saying they agree on 98.9% of the things, that was universal. I found everywhere I went. That 1.1% of disagreement ends up becoming the headline. We've just got to tune it out. And I heard that everywhere I went was people were tuning out the headlines and just getting back to work. And that's what we need to do here as well, here in Albuquerque and the New Mexico rainforest. So I'll end with this final thing. I talked about the weeds growing through the cracks. And here in New Mexico, of course, the flower coming out of the prickly pear is something you are all probably very familiar with. I think of it the same thing, right? Out of the thorns and the most harsh environments, you have flowers that are ready to bloom. And that is the process of entrepreneurship. And it's also the process of spurring entrepreneurship and building these ecosystems, which is finding ways to find opportunities for flowers to grow in the toughest of environments. And if you do that right, then you have an entire flourishing of flowers across the desert landscape. And I do have to apologize for this photo, because I was looking last night for a photo of a New Mexico desert landscape with lots of flowers, and it was on my wall in the hotel. So I took a picture of the wall of my hotel, and it was the best picture I could find, actually. So totally unattributed. I don't know who the photographer is. I apologize for it, but I just thought it's on the wall of my hotel here, which is right across the street. So I thought it was a lovely photo. So thank you, whoever took that photo. And this is the New Mexico landscape, and the ability to build ecosystems here as a desert and the rainforest is something that is real and meaningful and is happening. So I'm very excited for you and really proud to have been here, and thank you so much for the great work you do, and thanks for having me here today.